My grandma killed her mom in the same fashion as Erik and Lyle Menendez killed their parents. Scratch that, it was actually in a much more brutal and gory way. And there are so many similarities between the two cases, yet their outcomes are completely different. So let's talk about it. In September of 1990, my grandma Chris was giving her mom Lois a bath. Lois was in her 60s and was recovering from a hip surgery, so she needed the extra help. And my grandma didn't mind going to her home to help her. They both lived in Yakima, Washington, which is my hometown. At some point during the bath, my grandma brought up her childhood and how she was severely sexually abused by one of her stepdads. I won't go into detail about the abuse, but just know that it was really bad. This is when Lois reportedly admitted to knowing about the abuse the entire time it was happening, but she blamed my grandma for it and not the stepdad. What followed has never really been explained, but an altercation happened that resulted in Lois, my great-grandma, drowning. Instead of calling the police, my grandma went back to her house, which was right down the road, and didn't say a word to anybody. Over the next 2 days, according to what my grandma said, she couldn't stop hearing Lois's voice, even though at this point, Lois had long been dead. So my grandma went back to her house where she was still in the tub, obviously, and she proceeded to dismember her mom with a handsaw. She cut her body into 8 pieces, focusing on her jaw because she said she needed her to stop talking. And then she threw what was left into a local landfill. She took the major pieces, which included her head, artificial hip, and jaw, and put them into 2 garbage cans and then filled them up with cement. My grandma then rented a storage unit where she hid her mom's body parts for 2 whole years. Now, during this time, she was spotted by Lois's neighbors in her backyard with a blue tarp and a shovel. But she would go on to tell everyone, including the police, that Lois had taken a spontaneous trip to Hawaii with a rich man that she had recently met. She even faked letters claiming to be Lois that she then sent to everyone, trying to make things look less suspicious. I still have one of the letters, and it's honestly really creepy to read knowing the truth behind it. During this time, my grandma cashed Lois's social security checks and even sold her second home and kept the money. In total, I think she stole around $140,000. People started suspecting that she could have been involved in her mom's sudden disappearance, and after investigators started focusing on her, she turned herself in 2 years later. Now, during the trial, the defense argued that my grandma just snapped because she had PTSD from the severe trauma that she experienced as a child. It was argued that my grandma's mental growth was stunted because of the abuse, and so when her mom admitted to knowing about it the entire time, it pushed her over the edge, causing her to commit murder. Because of this, my grandma was convicted of second-degree manslaughter and served just under 2 years in prison. She's been out ever since, living in the exact same house as she was during the murders. Because of how much attention that the Menendez brothers story is getting, it's caused me to really compare the two cases, and I just can't help but notice how similar they are. It's kind of scary. But the only difference is my grandma only served 2 years in prison. She's gotten to live a relatively normal life ever since. Meanwhile, the Menendez brothers are serving a life sentence. They didn't get a life, and I just don't think that's very fair when there are cases almost identical to theirs with such different outcomes. Don't get me wrong, murder is bad, and no shade to my grandma, but it's not hard to see why she got out and they didn't. In both cases, the suspects killed their parents in a brutal way. And technically speaking, my grandma was probably a little bit worse with how she did it. They both lied to cover it up afterwards, but while Erik and Lyle only lied for 6 months, my grandma lied for years. They both spent their parents' money after the fact, which doesn't look good in either cases, and they were all victims of horrific sexual abuse as children. Yet for some reason, my grandma was seen as a victim while Erik and Lyle weren't. And I know for a fact it's because men who experience sexual assault even as children a lot of the times aren't seen as victims. And it's a shame because they were victims and they are victims, just like my grandma was. And this all happened around the same time, so it's just really crazy how similar they are, yet how different everything ended up for them. I just cannot stop thinking about this, and it is really eating at my brain. I'm just really hoping that the new evidence in the Menendez brothers case will be taken into account. They deserve a life too.